You know, I just finished reading a book called I Killed, and it's a story. It's a book about road stories of comedians. A lot of famous comedians like Jerry Seinfeld and Richard Pryor and Steve Martin and a lot of the famous comedians that you've seen on TV. But a lot of them were comedians that I'd actually never heard of, and having been a fan of stand-up comedy all the way since I was a young man, a young kid, in fact, all the way up until, I became a comedian and started traveling on the road. I love reading about comedians and studying comedians, and I was surprised that I hadn't heard of a lot of the people that were in the book. I really enjoyed the book. There's a lot of good road stories, but it reminded me that people like to hear stories on the road. What goes on behind the scenes, what kind of things happen while you're doing a show, for instance, or after the show. So I thought I'd share some of those things with you, some of my road stories. Some of the stories will involve some famous comedians that I've met, I've done shows with, from Robin Williams and Dana Carvey and Dave Coulier and Jay Leno, some of the famous comedians. But a lot of the funniest comedians I know were comedians that I had never heard of. Never heard of it, and only played with them at smaller venues or maybe casinos, things like that. Brad Bonner Jr. is a very good friend of mine. Did a lot of shows with him. He has a couple of dry bar specials. You've got Dennis Gaxiola, another dry bar comedian, very good friend of mine that I met when he was still in the military and not yet a full-time comedian. And a lot of people. For instance, Leland Cotton Brown is one of the funniest people I've ever met in my life, and yet you will never hear of him. I found one YouTube video of him when he was much younger, when he was first starting out, and he was very funny, but now he is just hilarious. But he doesn't want to be famous. I'm reading a book, rereading a book right now called Born Standing Up by Steve Martin. And Steve Martin talks about how fame almost completely destroyed his life when he was at the peak of his comedy career. A lot of comedians are like that. A lot of entertainers are like that, as you know from news. I want to tell you a story about fame and a lesson I learned from a man by the name, well, I'm not going to give his name. I'm going to tell you the story and reveal his name. I went to see Joe Rogan perform on a night when I didn't have a show at Cobb's Comedy Club in San Francisco. Very big comedy club. They get a lot of big names there. And Joe Rogan is a fantastic comedian. His style is a little rough, language-wise, but he's a good comedian. He's very smart. Has some very intelligent material. And I went to see him on I think a Saturday night in San Francisco at Cobb's Comedy Club, as I said, and enjoyed the show. And afterwards, went backstage, talked to him briefly in the green room, and then I had to head on out. I lived in the North Bay, and so I left the comedy club. But as I was coming out of the backstage area, there was another entourage coming in. And there was a man in a long trench coat, like Columbo would wear. For instance, for those of you who remember Columbo. He didn't have a hat on. He didn't have his face covered or anything. But I only casually glanced at him when I noticed that there was a whole group of people around him following him in. And I thought, well, it must be somebody with a name because he has an entourage. So I kind of went out the door and waited out on the street for this group to come out because I was kind of curious who that man was. So as I waited on the street out there, and it was late in the evening, late at night. The streets weren't packed with people as they normally would be. So I stood out about maybe a half a block up from the comedy club, up the hill, and I just kind of hung out standing against a wall and just loitering, basically. Finally, I see the doors open to the comedy club, and out comes this man in the raincoat and his followers behind him. And I started noticing that the followers behind him looked more like family or friends, something like that. They weren't armed guards or anything protecting somebody famous. They weren't a posse. They were an entourage. And as they came out and headed up the sidewalk, I recognized the man in the trench coat. The man in the trench coat was Dave Foley. Now, if you've never heard of Dave Foley, maybe you've heard of the Kids in the Hall. He came out of Canada as a stand-up comedian. He landed a job on a sitcom, one of my favorite sitcoms of the 80s, News Radio. News Radio is also where I first noticed Joe Rogan. Though with Rogan, I had a name in my head from Taekwondo, and in fact, I had attended a tournament with Joe Rogan, unbeknownst to me at that time. He was very big in the Taekwondo world, and then he kind of branched into MMA. But Joe Rogan first really caught my eye when he was on News Radio. He played Joe Gorelli, who was a mechanic, so to speak. He was the fix-it man in the radio station that the show centered around. And Dave Foley played his boss, also called Dave on the show. And I really liked the show, watched it all the time. That's where Andy Dick came from and a lot of others. It was a good show. I noticed it was Dave Foley, and I realized, well, they've been friends since their News Radio days, so it makes sense that he would be there. So at that time, though, News Radio had gone off the air a long time ago, and Joe Rogan, in fact, at that time was filming Fear Factor, which was a game show on TV called Fear Factor, and he mentioned in his comedy routine that he was hosting that show. But at that time, Dave Foley was the host of Celebrity Poker on ESPN. And he had a famous phrase. He would say, "Shuffle up and deal," right before they would start to deal the poker game. And I watched it all the time, and Dave was very funny on that show as well. So as Dave started up the road toward me, I shouted out from the shadows, "Shuffle up and deal, Dave!" That caught his attention, and he looked toward me, and he smiled, and he walked over to me, and he shook my hand and struck up a conversation. And we stood there and talked for a while, and we talked about the comedy business and so on and so forth, and he encouraged me in that. And as we were talking, I happened to mention, I said, "Dave, back in the 80s, you were very popular on TV, and a lot of people recognized you, I'm sure." And he said, yes. And I said, "But now you've kind of faded from the scene. You've done some movies. I've seen him in a couple of movies at that time." And I said, "You've done some movies, and you're on Celebrity Poker and everything, but nobody seems to recognize you." There were several people that walked down the street and didn't even pay any attention to who he was. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "I have the perfect amount of fame." He said, "People will still recognize me occasionally, but," he said, "even when they do, they're like you. They're very polite. They'll shake my hand. Maybe they'll ask for an autograph, but not always." He said, "But I don't get mobbed, and I'm able to walk the streets with relative anonymity. I can walk around and nobody really bothers me that much." And he said, like I said, the ones that do are very polite. That taught me something about fame. Fame can be an inconvenience. And in Steve Martin's book, Born Standing Up, he says that people complain that celebrities want fame when it's advantageous to them, but they don't want it when it's an inconvenience. And as Steve Martin said, that is absolutely true. And it is. It would be true of you if you were famous. So I never really fought to be famous. People wanted to know why I moved back to this small town of Prattville, Alabama, after doing comedy for 10 years out in California. Let me tell you, I never sought fame. Fame is a fleeting thing. And in Steve Martin's book, he mentions that he quit stand-up comedy, walked away from it, and never looked back because it was too much. It lost what he got into comedy to do. I must say that for me it was the same thing. I walked away from stand-up for almost 10 years simply because it was no longer fun. It was a tedious job. And when it became a tedious job, and I was no longer doing it because I enjoyed it, I walked away. See, fame is not all it's cracked up to be. And these famous people that I'm going to tell you about, they're just ordinary people. They're ordinary people like you and me with ordinary problems and everyday anxieties, just like us. I hope you've enjoyed this little story, and I'll be back to share more with you.